Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the only place on the frontier for the truest, grittiest stories this side of the unforgiving West. We tell the tales of the legends, forged in gunpowder and grit, whose names are still whispered on the wind. Before we spur this horse into a gallop, do us a solid and subscribe to the channel, and make sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you won't miss a single sunset on one of our adventures. Now, find some cover, check your ammunition, and listen to the story of the Thorn Valley Ranch, of the widow who owned it, and the vengeance squad she raised from the dust. The Thorn Valley Ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was a promise. Nestled in a sweeping basin carved by God's own hand, it was a sanctuary of green pastures and clear-running streams in a territory more accustomed to sun-bleached bone and thirsty earth. Jacob Thorn had built it with his own two hands, his laughter echoing off the canyon walls as he raised every beam of the ranch house, every post of the sprawling corrals. He was a good man, a strong man, and his vision had drawn good, loyal men to his side. They weren't gunfighters or fortune seekers, they were ranch hands, men whose wealth was measured in honest sweat, and whose word was as solid as the granite mountains that guarded the valley. And at the heart of it all was Madeleine Thorn. To the world, and even to the men who worked the ranch, she was the perfect complement to Jacob's rugged strength. She was quiet, graceful, with a love for the wild flowers that grew by the creek and the leather-bound books she had brought with her from the east. They saw her as the gentle heart of the home, the calm center of their bustling world. They saw a lady, fragile and precious, to be protected from the harsh realities of the frontier. It was a perception she had never corrected. The promise of the Thorn Valley was shattered by a man named Corvus Cain. He was not a common bandit. He was a plague, a man who ruled a small army of cutthroats with a cold, reptilian intelligence. Cain didn't want the Thorn Ranch, he wanted to break it. He saw Jacob Thorn's prosperity and decency as a personal affront to his own philosophy that the world belonged to the wolves, not the shepherds. The attack was not a raid, it was an execution. Cain and 20 of his men descended on the ranch not to steal cattle, but to steal its soul. They rode in under the pretense of a parley. Jacob, ever honorable, met them in the open, his loyal foreman, Silas, at his side. It was a trap. They shot him down where he stood, not in a duel, but in a volley of cowardly gunfire. They beat old Silas half to death and left him in the dust beside his boss's body. They rode away laughing, leaving behind a silence in the valley that was louder and more terrible than any scream. The world Madeleine had known ended in that moment. The townsfolk from the nearest settlement, a full day's ride away, offered their condolences. The law, a distant and toothless entity, filed a report and offered its regrets. They all saw a broken woman, a widow who would surely sell off the ranch and flee back to the safety of civilization. Her own ranch hands, their hearts broken, looked at her with pity and sorrow. They saw their gentle mistress, lost and adrift, and they waited for the inevitable order to begin dismantling the dream they had all helped to build. For a month, the silence of the valley was the silence of a graveyard. Madeleine was a ghost in her own house, a black-clad specter moving through rooms that echoed with the memory of her husband's voice. The ranch hands kept to their duties, their movements slow and heavy with grief, their loyalty to Jacob's memory the only thing keeping them from drifting away. But what they all mistook for the silence of grief was, in fact, the silence of a forge. Inside Madeleine Thorn, a terrible and profound transformation was taking place. Her sorrow was not drowning her, it was tempering her. The gentle, loving woman was being burned away, leaving behind a core of pure and yielding, ice-cold steel. Her love for her husband had not died, it had been reforged into a new, terrible shape, the promise of absolute and total retribution. One evening, as the last light of the sun bled from the sky, she called the 5 most loyal hands to the main barn. There was old Silas, his face now a mask of angry scars, his loyalty to the Thorns absolute. There was Leo, young, hot-headed, and spoiling for a fight he didn't know how to win. There was Mateo, the quiet, watchful tracker of Mexican descent, who could read the land like a book. And there were Ben and Tom, 2 brothers, sturdy and reliable, the quiet workhorses of the ranch. They gathered in the cavernous, hay-scented darkness, expecting the words of defeat they had all been dreading. They saw their mistress, a slight, lonely figure standing before them, her face pale in the lantern light. "I know what you're expecting," Madeleine said, her voice quiet but clear, devoid of the tremor they anticipated. You expect me to sell, to run. You expect me to say that this valley, and my husband's dream, died with him. She paused, her gaze moving from one man to the next, holding their eyes. You are wrong. Jacob's dream did not die. It was murdered. And we are going to answer that murder. A confused murmur went through the small group. Silas stepped forward, his expression pained. Maddie, Mrs. Thorne, what can we do? We're ranch hands, not gunfighters. Cain has an army. Madeleine didn't answer with words. She turned to a large wooden crate behind her. With a smooth, practiced motion, she pried open the lid with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was not a collection of memories, but an arsenal. There were Winchester repeating rifles, brand new. There were Colt Peacemaker revolvers, their blued steel gleaming. And there were boxes upon boxes of ammunition. The men stared, speechless. This is my dowry, Madeleine said, her voice taking on a hard, metallic edge they had never heard before. My father did not approve of my marriage to a simple rancher. He was a man who believed in a different kind of power. She reached into the crate and drew out a pair of Colt revolvers with worn, smooth walnut grips. He taught me how to use them. He taught me how to fight, how to plan, and how to survive. She turned to face them, the revolvers held down at her sides, but with a familiarity that was utterly shocking. The fragile, bookish woman was gone. In her place stood someone they had never seen, someone they couldn't have imagined. You are ranch hands, she said, her voice now ringing with command. But you are also loyal. You are strong. And you are all that is left of Jacob's legacy. From tonight, your work is no longer just with cattle and fences. Your work is with these. She nodded towards the crate. I will train you. I will teach you everything my father taught me. We will do it in secret, after the day's work is done, in the barns and the far canyons where no one can see or hear us. You will learn to shoot, to ride, to fight not as individuals, but as a single, vengeful fist. You are Jacob's men, and you will become his justice. The secret was out. The silence of the valley was about to be broken by the crack of gunfire and the forging of a vengeance squad. The gentle widow was gone, and in her place, a leader had been born from the ashes of her grief. The first training session took place the following night in the cavernous main barn, a place that had only ever known the smells of hay, horses, and honest labor. Now, it smelled of gun oil and disbelief. The 5 ranch hands stood awkwardly, staring at the line of brand-new Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers Madeleine had laid out on a series of blankets. The weapons seemed alien and menacing in the warm, familiar space. These men were not strangers to firearms. They owned hunting rifles for bringing in venison and carried old Cap'n ball revolvers for snakes and coyotes. But they were tools, like a shovel or an axe, to be used infrequently and for practical purposes. The idea of becoming proficient, of turning these tools into extensions of their own will, was a foreign concept. Their disbelief was focused primarily on Madeleine. They had watched her arrange flowers, pour tea, and read poetry. Now, she stood before them, a Colt Peacemaker held in her hand, her posture transformed. The soft, gentle curve of her shoulders had been replaced by a ramrod's straight spine. Her hands, which they had only ever seen tending her garden, held the heavy revolver with an unshakable steadiness. A gun is not a talisman, she began, her voice crisp and authoritative, echoing in the rafters. It does not make you brave. It does not make you strong. It is a machine. A simple, stupid machine. It will do exactly what you tell it to do. If your hands shake, your bullet will fly wide. If your mind wanders, you will miss your shot. The weapon is not in your hand. It is here. She tapped her temple with the knuckle of her free hand. And here, she placed a hand over her heart. Clarity and control. That is what we will learn. Leo, the young hothead, scoffed, a quiet, almost involuntary sound of skepticism. He was the best shot among them, and natural with his hunting rifle, and he couldn't wrap his mind around being taught by the boss's wife. Madeleine's eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian chips, snapped to him. You doubt me, Leo. No, lamb, he mumbled, his face flushing. It's just, you're a lady. I am, Madeleine agreed, her voice dangerously soft. But I am also my father's daughter." She turned and gestured to a series of tin cans they had set up against the far wall of the barn, nearly 50 feet away. "Silas, toss a coin." The old foreman, his face a mask of confusion, pulled a silver dollar from his pocket and tossed it high into the air, the coin glinting in the lantern light as it tumbled end over end. The barn was filled with a single, deafening roar. Madeleine had not seemed to move. One moment the gun was at her side, the next it was level, spitting fire. The silver dollar, caught at the apex of its arc, was sent flying into the darkness with a sharp ping. She had not aimed. She had simply looked, raised the gun, and fired, all in one seamless, lightning-fast motion. She turned back to the 5 stunned men, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel of her Colt. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and their silent, utter shock. Leo's mouth was hanging open. "The next person who calls me a lady in that tone," Madeleine said, her voice as flat and cold as a tombstone, "will be picking up cans for a month. Are we clear?" 5 heads nodded in unison. The teacher had established her credentials. The lessons that followed were a brutal awakening. She was a harsh, demanding, and brilliant instructor. She broke down the art of shooting into a science. She taught them stance, grip, breath control, and trigger squeeze. She made them practice drawing their revolvers empty hours until the motion was smooth and ingrained in their muscle memory. "Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast," she would repeat, her voice a constant, critical presence behind them. "You are not trying to be the fastest. You are trying to be the most certain." The graveyard is full of fast men who couldn't hit what they were aiming at. She taught them things they had never considered. She taught them to shoot with both eyes open, to be aware of their surroundings. She taught them to reload under pressure, her voice a sharp crack in their ear as they fumbled with cartridges, their fingers suddenly thick and clumsy. She was not just teaching them to shoot, she was remaking them. She stripped away their casual, civilian habits and began to instill the mindset of a soldier. She was particularly hard on Leo, seeing in his natural talent a dangerous arrogance. "You hit the can, Leo," she said one evening after he'd perfectly drilled 3 targets in a row. "But you were admiring your work. You were dead. While you were feeling proud, the man to your left just put a bullet in your ear. Never admire. Shoot, assess, find the next target. Always." Her knowledge was not limited to handguns. She taught them the brutal efficiency of the Winchester rifle, how to use the lever action to lay down a steady, accurate stream of fire. She taught them the devastating power of a shotgun at close range. But the most profound change was in how they saw her. The gentle woman they had known was a ghost, a memory. In her place was this leader, this commander, whose eyes seemed to see every flaw, every hesitation. They saw the cold fire in her gaze as she corrected their stance, the unwavering certainty in her hands as she demonstrated a reload. They began to understand that the quiet grace she had always possessed was not a sign of fragility, but of a deep, powerful, and now terrifyingly unleashed self-control. The training was not just physical. It was a forging of their will. As the empty brass cartridges piled up on the barn floor, their respect for her grew mingled with a healthy dose of fear. They saw the pain in her eyes, the grief that was the fuel for this incredible transformation. And it made them work harder. They were not just learning to fight for themselves. They were learning to fight for her, for the memory of Jacob, and for the valley he had loved. The ranch hands were being broken down, and from the pieces, their unexpected teacher was building an army. The secret life of the Thorn Valley Ranch took on a rigorous, exhausting rhythm. By day, the 5 men were cowboys and laborers, mending fences, tending to the herd, their movements imbued with a weary sense of normalcy for any distant eyes that might be watching. But the moment the sun dipped below the western peaks, casting long, cool shadows across the valley, their true work began. The barn, the corrals, and the remote, box-ended canyons became their classrooms, and Madeleine Thorn their unforgiving professor in the art of war. The training grew more complex, moving beyond the fundamentals of marksmanship. Madeleine was building not just a group of shooters, but a cohesive fighting unit. She drew on the memories of her father's lessons she had once dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of an old soldier, but which now returned to her with a chilling, life-or-death clarity. "Corvus Kane has numbers," she told them one evening, her figure a silhouette against a large map of the territory she had pinned to the barn wall. We have surprise and we have terrain. We will never meet them on an open field. We will choose our ground. We will be the ghosts they hear in the rocks, the flash of fire in the dark. We fight, and we vanish. She began to drill them in small tactics. She taught them how to use hand signals, to communicate without a word. She would send them out into the rocky hills at night, giving them a rendezvous point and forcing them to navigate by the stars, to move silently, to learn the feel of the land under their boots in the pitch black. Mateo, the quiet tracker, excelled at this, and Madeleine quickly designated him as the unit's scout, their eyes and ears. She turned the familiar landscape of the ranch into a training ground of deadly puzzles. She would have them practice ambushes, using the natural cover of a dry creek bed or a thicket of mesquite. She taught them the concept of interlocking fields of fire, positioning them in a way that their shots would cover each other, leaving no safe approach for an enemy. "You are a wolf pack now," she would say, her voice low and intense as they crouched in the darkness. "Silas, you are the anchor, the steady fire. Ben and Tom, you are the flanks, you keep them from circling. Leo, you are the shock, the first, hard hit. And Mateo, you are the whisper that finds them. You each have a role. You trust the man next to you to do his. That is the only way we survive." The physical and mental toll was immense. The men grew leaner, harder. The soft edges of their civilian lives were being ground away, leaving behind a core of hardened muscle and watchful intensity. The easy camaraderie of the bunkhouse was replaced by the quiet, focused bond of soldiers. They didn't talk about what they were doing, not in detail. The unspoken purpose hung in the air between them, a shared burden and a sacred vow. Madeleine's own transformation continued. She seemed to shed what was left of her old self like a snake sheds its skin. She took to wearing practical, dark riding clothes, her hair tied back severely. The books of poetry were replaced by ledgers in which she meticulously tracked their ammunition stores and the intelligence Mateo gathered on his scouting trips. He would ride for days, a ghost on the plains, returning with detailed reports of Kane's operations, the location of his smaller camps, the routes his raiders used, the names of his key lieutenants. Madeleine would take this information and mark her map, the red pins indicating Kane's men like a spreading disease, a disease she was formulating the cure for. One night, as she was demonstrating how to quickly clear a jammed rifle, a flashback, sharp and unwelcome, struck her. She was a girl of 16 again, standing in a dusty yard with her father, a grizzled ex-marshal whose eyes held the same hard light she now saw in her own reflection. He was forcing her to do the same drill, over and over, his voice impatient. "The hesitation is what kills you, Maddie," he had barked. "You stop to think, you die." At the time, she had hated him for it, for forcing his violent world upon her. Now, in the dark barn, surrounded by her own small army, she understood. He hadn't been teaching her to be a killer. He had been teaching her to survive in a world that contained men like Corvus Kane. He had given her the terrible, necessary tools she was now passing on. The revelation did not comfort her, it chilled her. She was becoming him. She was becoming the thing she had run from to find peace in Jacob's arms. The grief for her husband was now intertwined with a new grief, a grief for the woman she was irrevocably leaving behind. The ranch hands saw this change, this internal war. They saw the moments when her mask of command would slip, when a profound sadness would settle in her eyes. And it made their loyalty to her absolute. They were not just following a commander, they were protecting a woman who was sacrificing everything, including herself, for the sake of the only justice this land would ever offer. The training culminated in a final, brutal test. Madeleine had identified a small, remote line cabin used by one of Kane's patrols, a group of 3 men who used it as a base to extort local homesteaders. "This is not a drill," she told her 5 men as they gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their horses saddled, their rifles loaded. "This is a rehearsal. We will go there. We will disarm them. We will take them. And we will leave no doubt in their minds about who we are. We move at dawn." They rode out, a small, dark column of 6 riders against the bruised purple of the nascent dawn. They were no longer just men filled with grief and gunpowder. They had been forged into something new, something hard and sharp. They were a weapon, and their teacher was about to aim them at the heart of their enemy for the very first time. The raid on the line cabin was a swift, brutal, and flawlessly executed operation. It was over in less than 5 minutes. Following Madeleine's precise plan, Matteo had scouted the location, identifying the cabin's blind spots. They approached under the cover of the rising sun's glare, their horses' hooves muffled in the sandy soil. It was not a battle of gunfire. It was an exercise in shock and overwhelming force. Leo and the brothers, Ben and Tom, burst through the front door while Silas and Matteo covered the single window and the back. The three outlaws, bleary-eyed and still shaking off the effects of a night of cheap whiskey, were disarmed and subdued before they could even register the attack. Madeleine did not enter the cabin. She waited outside, a calm, commanding presence on her horse. When her men emerged, prodding the three captured outlaws before them, she looked down at the thugs, her face an unreadable mask. "Who are you people?" one of the outlaws snarled, his bravado a thin cover for his fear. Madeleine leaned forward in her saddle. "We are the ghosts of the men you've robbed and killed," she said, her voice a low whisper that was more menacing than a shout. "We are Jacob Thorne's memory. They didn't kill them. That was not the purpose of this first strike. The purpose was to send a message." They bound the three men, took their guns and horses, and left them stranded 50 miles from the nearest friendly outpost with a single canteen of water between them. And they left something else. Before leaving, Madeleine used her knife to carve a simple, stark T for Thorne onto the cabin door. They rode back to the valley in silence, the weight of their first true act of aggression settling upon them. They had crossed the line. There was no turning back. The exhilaration of their success was tempered by a grim understanding of the path they had now irrevocably chosen. That night, Madeleine knew, was a pivot point. The bond forged in the secret training needed to be sealed, transformed from a shared purpose into a sacred vow. She had them build a large fire in the center of the main corral, the dancing flames pushing back the vast, dark emptiness of the desert night. The 6 of them gathered around it, the firelight catching the hard new lines on their faces and the cold steel of the revolvers on their hips. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills. The shared experience of the day's raid hung between them, a tangible thing. Madeleine was the one to break the silence. She looked at each of her men, her gaze lingering on their faces, seeing not just the soldiers she was creating, but the good men they were, the men Jacob had trusted. "Today," she began, her voice quiet but resonant in the still night air, "we stopped being victims. We stopped waiting for a justice that was never going to come. We took the first step." She drew her revolver, not in a threatening way, but with a slow, deliberate reverence. She held it in her hands, the firelight gleaming on its barrel. "This is a heavy burden we have chosen to pick up. The path ahead will be paved with violence and grief. Some of us may not see the end of it. Before we take another step, every man here needs to understand what we are becoming." She paused, her eyes locking onto theirs. "We are not lawmen. We are not soldiers in a recognized army. To the world, we will be no better than the men we are hunting. But in our hearts, we must know the difference. They are driven by greed. We are driven by a debt to a good man, and to a good life that was stolen from us." She stood up, her slight frame casting a long, powerful shadow. "Tonight, we make a promise. We swear an oath. To Jacob, to this valley, and to each other." She raised the revolver, pointing its barrel towards the dark, star-dusted sky. "We are no longer just the hands of the Thorn Valley Ranch. We are its fist. We are its sword. We are the justice this land has been denied. We will hunt the men who brought darkness to this valley, and we will deliver them to the darkness they serve. We will be a whisper in the night, a terror to the wicked. We will be the consequence." Old Silas was the first to rise, his scarred face a mask of grim determination. He drew his own weapon and raised it beside hers. "For Jacob," he said, his voice a low, gravelly oath. Leo stood next, his youthful arrogance replaced by a burning intensity. He raised his gun. "For the valley." Matteo, Ben, and Tom rose as one, their movements silent and sure, their own revolvers joining the circle of steel pointed at the heavens. They stood there for a long moment, a small circle of 6 against the vast, indifferent darkness, their faces illuminated by the fire, their wills forged into a single, unbreakable point. They were a secret army, born in grief, baptized in gunpowder, and now, bound by an oath sworn in the heart of the lonely night. The vengeance squad of the Thorn Valley was ready to begin its bloody work. The story of the three disarmed, horseless outlaws stumbling back into Corvus Cain's main camp became a source of grim amusement for the 20 or so cutthroats who called the desolate canyon home. They mocked the men's incompetence, laughing at the tale of being trapped in a net by a ghost army. But Corvus Cain was not laughing. He listened to the story in a cold, predatory silence, his eyes fixed on the crude carved into a piece of leather saddlebag the men had salvaged. Cain was a student of power, and he understood that what had happened was not a fluke. It was a message, delivered with an intelligence and precision that was completely alien to the brutish world of frontier banditry he dominated. The humiliation was the point. The lack of bloodshed was the signature. It was an act of psychological warfare. "The widow," he said, the words a soft hiss of venom. He looked at the faces of his men, seeing the smug disbelief in their eyes. "You think this is a joke? You think a woman and a handful of farm boys have declared war on us?" He picked up a branding iron from his fire, its tip glowing a malevolent orange. "This land has a natural order. The strong, like us, feed on the weak. The Thorn Ranch was a fat sheep, and we took our due. Now, one of the ewes has learned to bite. We do not tolerate this. We do not allow the natural order to be questioned." He slammed the hot brand onto a wooden post, the tea of the Thorn Ranch brand searing into the wood with a sizzle and a plume of smoke. "This brand is a challenge, an insult. I want the man who leads them. I want the widow. I want her brought to me. I want her to kneel in the dirt of this camp and beg me to kill her. And I want the Thorn Valley turned to ash." He turned to his most trusted and feared lieutenant, a hulking, bearded man named Gideon, whose preferred weapon was a well-honed axe. "Gideon, take a dozen men. Ride to the settlement of Redemption. The merchants there have been paying us for protection for years. Double the tax. Tell them it's a widow's tax. Spread the word that anyone who sympathizes with the Thorn Ranch will see their homes burned. I want her isolated. I want her name to be a curse in this territory. Squeeze them until they bleed, and if they squeak, make an example of one of them." Gideon grinned, a brutal expression. "It'll be done." The news of Gideon's mission reached Madeleine within a week. Mateo, her silent scout, had shadowed the war party, his report delivered in a low, grim whisper. "They're at Redemption. They've taken over the saloon. They're hurting people, boss. Making them pay for what we did." Madeleine felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. This was the consequence of her actions. Her private war was now spilling over, threatening to consume the innocent people of the very territory she was trying to cleanse. She had planned for Cain's reaction, but the speed and cruelty of it were still a shock. She had wanted to haunt him, but now he was using the populace as a shield, as a weapon against her. She gathered her squad in the barn that night. The mood was somber. Their first victory felt hollow now, its price measured in the suffering of others. "He's trying to turn the territory against us," she told them, her voice tight with a controlled fury. "He wants to make us the villains. He wants to force us back into hiding, to make us afraid of the consequences of our own justice." "So what do we do?" Leo asked, his youthful face taut with anger. "We can't let him do this. We can't let them suffer because of us." "We will not," Madeleine affirmed. "We will not hide. We will answer. Gideon and his men are a limb of Cain's serpent. We are going to cut it off. We are going to show Cain, and the entire territory, that our justice does not stop at the borders of this valley. Anyone who acts in his name, anyone who preys on the innocent, is our enemy. We are going to Redemption." The plan she formulated was her most daring yet. A direct assault on a dozen men in a populated town was suicide. They had to be smarter. They had to use the town against the occupiers, just as she had used the ranch. They would need an ally on the inside. Mateo was dispatched ahead of them, not as a scout this time, but as an infiltrator. He shed his ranch hand clothes for the simple attire of a traveling Mexican laborer, his demeanor quiet and unassuming. He slipped into Redemption and made contact with the one person he knew he could trust, the town's doctor. A man who had been a close friend of Thomas Vance and who despised the outlaws who now infested his town. The plan was relayed in whispers, in the dead of night, in the doctor's surgery. It was a plan of surgical precision. Gideon and his men had grown complacent, taking over the saloon, drinking heavily, their guards posted but lazy. Their weakness was their arrogance. 3 nights later, the vengeance squad arrived. They did not ride into town. They left their horses miles away and approached on foot, ghosts in the darkness. They met the doctor at a prearranged spot, and he led them through the back alleys he knew like the back of his hand. The attack was a symphony of controlled violence, conducted by Madeleine from the shadows of an alley across from the saloon. Phase 1 was a distraction. At precisely 2 in the morning, a fire, set by the doctor's stable hand, erupted in the livery stable at the far end of town. The cry of fire went up, and half of Gideon's men, drunk and disorganized, stumbled out of the saloon to see what was happening. Phase 2 was the ambush. As the outlaws ran towards the fire, they passed a long, dark alleyway between the general store and the hotel. Silas, Ben, and Tom were waiting. They did not use rifles. At this range, in the dark, they used the devastating and personal blast of their shotguns. The alley became a thunderous echo chamber of death. The volley was overwhelming. The outlaws were sithed down, their charge turned into a pile of writhing bodies. Phase 3 was the assault. The moment the shotgun blast echoed, Madeleine, Leo, and Mateo stormed the saloon from the front. They burst through the swinging doors to find Gideon and the remaining 6 outlaws staggering to their feet, reaching for their guns, their faces a mask of drunken confusion. Madeleine did not hesitate. The memory of her father's training took over. Clarity and control. She fired twice, her Colt bucking in her hand. 2 outlaws fell. Leo, his face a mask of cold rage, opened up with his Winchester, the lever action a blur, each shot finding a target. Mateo moved like a phantom to the side, his pistols barking, cutting down another man who was trying to take cover behind the bar. Gideon, the hulking lieutenant, roared like a wounded bear. He ignored the others and charged, his axe raised, his eyes fixed on the one person he knew was the source of this nightmare, the woman. Madeleine had 1 shot left. She stood her ground as the mountain of a man charged at her, the polished head of his axe gleaming in the lamplight. She brought her revolver up, took a steadying breath, and fired. The bullet took Gideon in the knee, shattering the bone. He screamed and collapsed, his charge ending in a heap of agony at her feet. The entire firefight had lasted less than 30 seconds. The saloon was a scene of carnage, the air thick with the smell of blood, whiskey, and gunpowder. The squad moved with chilling efficiency. They confirmed their kills, gathered the weapons, and prepared to vanish back into the night. But before she left, Madeleine walked over to the groaning, defeated Gideon. She looked down at him, her face unreadable. She didn't kill him. She reloaded her revolver, deliberately, calmly. Then she leaned down and whispered in his ear, her voice a thread of ice. "This is the widow's tax," she said. "Tell your master he can come and collect it from me himself, if he has the courage." She stood up, and without a backward glance, she led her men out of the saloon and into the darkness, leaving a single, crippled survivor to carry her message. And a town that had just witnessed the birth of a legend. They had reaped the whirlwind and shown Corvus Cain that the arm of their vengeance was long indeed. The return of a crippled, terrified Gideon to Corvus Cain's camp was not a message, it was an earthquake. It shattered the foundation of Cain's power, which was built on the unshakable belief in his gang's invincibility. In a single, bloody night, a woman and 5 ranch hands had annihilated a dozen of his best men in a fortified town. They had not hit and run, they had executed a planned, military-style assault. The name Thorn was no longer a joke in the outlaw camps of the territory. It became a whisper, a curse. Stories began to circulate, growing more fantastic with each telling. They weren't just ranch hands, they were demons, ghosts who could move without sound and kill without mercy. They were led by a witch, a black-clad widow who could not be killed, who had made a pact with the devil himself for her revenge. Corvus Cain felt the shift in power like a change in the wind. The fear he had so carefully cultivated was now being redirected at him. His men grew restless, their drunken boasts replaced by nervous glances into the darkness. Recruitment dried up. The legend of the Thorn Valley Vengeance Squad was becoming more powerful than his own reputation. For Cain, the war became a personal obsession. He withdrew, his handsome face growing gaunt, his eyes taking on the haunted, paranoid gleam of a man who sees ghosts in every shadow. He offered a staggering bounty for any information on the widow and her men, a sum that could make a poor man a king. He sent out patrols not to raid, but to hunt, to find the Thorn Valley and the secret army it was hiding. Madeleine, in turn, adapted her strategy. She knew a direct confrontation with Kane's full force would be suicide. The raid on Redemption had been a necessary, thunderous statement. Now, it was time to become the ghosts the Outlaws feared. Her war moved into the shadows. "We will not meet him head-on," she told her squad. "We will bleed him. We will dismantle his empire piece by piece, until all that is left is the serpent, coiled and alone in its nest." The Vengeance Squad became a true guerrilla force. Mateo was their linchpin. He spent weeks at a time on the trail, a phantom living off the land, his ears open to the whispers in the lonely saloons and remote homesteads. He became a master of disguise and deception, mapping out Kane's entire network of informants, supply caches, and safe houses. With this intelligence, Madeleine conducted a campaign of 1,000 cuts. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with fear and attrition. They would strike at night. A supply wagon carrying ammunition to one of Kane's camps would be found in the morning, its horses gone, its cargo burned to ashes, and the stark, single T carved into the wagon's side. An informant who was known to sell information to Kane would wake to find that same T carved into his own front door, a silent, terrifying warning that he was being watched. The flow of information to Kane began to choke and die. They used the land itself as a weapon. They would cause rock slides to block the canyons Kane's men used, forcing them on long, arduous detours. They would poison remote wells along their patrol routes, not with a lethal dose, but enough to make the men violently ill, sowing sickness and dissent in their ranks. Leo, whose hot-headedness Madeleine had worked so hard to temper, found his calling in these lightning raids. He became the squad's premier saboteur, his youthful energy channeled into a focused, destructive purpose. He relished the fear they were spreading, a fact that worried old Silas. "The boy is starting to enjoy this too much, Maddie," Silas confided in her one evening, as they watched Leo practice with his knife, a cold, predatory smile on his face. "We started this for Jacob, for justice. I'm afraid the boy is starting to do it for the thrill of the hunt." Madeleine felt a pang of guilt. Silas was right. She saw it in all of them, and in herself. The grim necessity of their mission was slowly being supplanted by a dark, intoxicating power. They were becoming the thing they were fighting. The line between justice and vengeance, once so clear in her mind, was becoming blurred, like a trail in a dust storm. Her own internal struggle deepened. She was a brilliant strategist, a cold and effective commander, but the cost was a growing emptiness inside her. She no longer dreamed of Jacob's smiling face. She dreamed of maps and firing angles, of the look of terror in a man's eyes in the split second before a bullet struck. The ghosts she had promised the Outlaws were taking up residence in her own soul. The campaign of Whispers was devastatingly effective. Corvus Kane grew more isolated, more paranoid. He trusted no one. He moved his main camp 3 times, convinced he had a traitor in his midst. His force dwindled, men deserting in the night rather than faced and seen, relentless enemy that was dismantling their world. He became a snake eating its own tail, his rage and suspicion doing as much damage as Madeleine's squad. The final piece of the puzzle came from Mateo. He had been on the trail for a month, pushing deeper into the Badlands than ever before. He returned, gaunt and exhausted, but his eyes burned with a triumphant light. He had followed a lone rider, one of Kane's most trusted men, to a hidden, box-ended canyon, fortified by nature and guarded by the last, most loyal core of Kane's gang. He unrolled a piece of worn leather on the barn floor. On it, he had sketched a detailed map from memory. "Al Nido del Serpiente," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The serpent's nest. This is it, boss. This is where he's hiding." Madeleine and her men gathered around the map. The air in the barn was thick with a sudden, electric tension. The long, bloody journey was nearing its end. The campaign of ghosts and whispers had worked. They had isolated the serpent. All that was left was to strike at the head. The map Mateo had sketched on the piece of worn leather was more than just lines and symbols. It was the culmination of their long, bloody campaign. It was the key to the final door. For 2 days, the Vengeance Squad did not sleep. They gathered in the main barn, the map spread out on a large table under the steady and wavering light of several lanterns, and they planned the death of Corvus Kane's enterprise. The Serpent's Nest was a natural fortress. A deep, box-ended canyon in the heart of the Dragon Mountains, accessible by only one narrow, winding trail. The canyon walls were sheer rock, offering no other way nor out. According to Mateo's reconnaissance, Kane had posted sentries at the mouth of the trail and on a high, rocky outcrop that served as an overwatch position. Inside the canyon, nestled against the back wall, was a collection of rough-hewn cabins and Leonto's last sanctuary for the dozen or so loyalists who remained with him. "This is not like redemption," Madeleine stated, her voice a low, focused hum. The men were gathered around the table, their faces grim, their attention absolute. "There are no civilians. There is no easy escape. This is a direct assault on a fortified military position. The risks are higher than they have ever been. There is no room for error." Her mind, honed by months of tactical thinking, dissected the problem. A frontal assault up the narrow trail was suicide. They would be cut to pieces before they got halfway. "We cannot attack the gate," she said, her finger tracing the trail on the map. "We must remove the ice first." The plan that took shape was one of audacious, synchronized violence, requiring each member of the squad to perform their role with perfect, life-or-death precision. It would be a two-pronged attack, a hammer and an anvil, executed under the cover of the new moon. "Mateo," Madeleine began, looking at her scout. "You and I will be the anvil. We will take out the overwatch. The cliffs are sheer, but you said there was a series of handholds on the eastern face, a climber's route." Mateo nodded. "It is difficult, dangerous, in the dark, almost impossible. But not impossible for you," Madeleine stated, her faith in him absolute. "We will scale the cliff before moonrise. We will deal with the sentry there. From that position," her finger tapped the outcrop on the map, "we will have a clear field of fire down into the entire canyon. We will be the signal. We will be the support." She then turned to the other four men. "Silas, you will be the hammer. You, Leo, Ben, and Tom will approach the main trail. You will not attack. You will wait in the rocks until you hear my first shot. That is the signal that the overwatch is clear. When you hear it, you will unleash hell on the sentries at the canyon mouth." Her strategy was to use speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence to shatter the enemy's command structure before they could mount a coherent defense. "Leo," she continued, her eyes locking with the young man's, "your job is chaos. The moment the sentries are down, you and the brothers are to charge into that canyon. Do not stop. Do not take cover. You are a thunderbolt. Your only goal is to get to the main cabin, Kane's cabin, and use the firebombs we've prepared. You will set it ablaze. You will create a beacon of panic in the heart of their camp." "Silas," she said, turning to the old foreman, "you are the rock. You will not charge in. You will take a fortified position at the mouth of the canyon. You will lay down a steady, covering fire. You will ensure that no one escapes. You are the cork in the bottle." It was a plan that played to each man's strength. Mateo's stealth, Leo's explosive aggression, the brothers' steadfast reliability, and Silas's unshakable nerve. And above it all, Madeleine would be the eye in the sky, the sniper, the general directing the flow of the battle from the high ground. For the next 2 days, they prepared. They cleaned and oiled their weapons until they functioned with mechanical perfection. They packed rations and medical supplies. They prepared the firebombs, their hands moving with a grim, practiced efficiency. The atmosphere in the valley was thick with a silent, heavy tension. The men spoke little, each lost in his own thoughts, contemplating the battle to come. They were no longer just seeking revenge for a man they had respected. They were fighting for their own survival, for the future of the valley, and for the fierce, broken woman who had led them out of their grief and into the fire. The night before they were to ride out, Madeleine found Leo sharpening his knife by the dying embers of the bunkhouse fire, a cold, almost ecstatic look in his eyes. "You are too eager for this, Leo," she said, her voice a quiet note in the darkness. He looked up, his expression hardening. "They killed Jacob. They made us live in fear. They deserve to die screaming." "They do," Madeleine agreed. "But we are not them. We are not doing this because we enjoy the killing. We are doing this to end it. Remember that. Remember the man you are, not the monster they want you to become. That is the only victory that will matter when the sun comes up." The young man looked away, his jaw tight, but he nodded. Madeleine's words had struck a chord, a reminder of the humanity they were all fighting so desperately not to lose. As she walked back to the main house, Silas was waiting for her on the porch, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "He's a good boy, Maddie," the old man said. "They're all good men." "I know," she replied. "Just be careful up on that cliff," he said, his voice thick with a fatherly concern. "Jacob, he wouldn't have wanted. Jacob would have wanted us to live in peace," Madeleine interrupted, her voice catching for the first time. "He would have wanted us to be safe. This is the only way. After this, Silas, after this, it's over. One way or another." They stood in silence for a moment, two souls bound by their love for a dead man and their commitment to a bloody dawn. The plan was laid. The weapons were ready. The serpent's lair awaited. The vengeance squad rode out from the Thorn Valley under a sliver of a moon, a silent column of 6 riders moving through the night. They were not just a squad anymore. They were a family, forged in the twin fires of grief and gunpowder. Each man knew his role, each man trusted the one beside him implicitly. Their 2-day ride to the Dragoon Mountains was a tense, silent pilgrimage, a journey towards the final altar of their vengeance. They made a cold camp on the last night, a few miles from the canyon, the earth thin and sharp with the scent of pine and the coming battle. There was no fire. They chewed on dried beef and spoke in low whispers, their words swallowed by the vast, dark emptiness of the high country. Madeleine, however, had a premonition, a cold, prickling sensation on the back of her neck that had kept her alive since this bloody business began. Cain was a cornered animal. He was paranoid, intelligent, and brutal. Would he truly just sit and wait in his nest? The thought gnawed at her. "Matteo," she whispered, her voice barely a rustle in the dark. "Something feels wrong. He knows we're coming. Not how, not when. But he knows. The bounty is high," Matteo acknowledged. "Someone may have talked." A whisper from Redemption, a rancher who saw us ride out. "Take a look," Madeleine ordered. "Don't go near the canyon. Circle wide. Check the approaches. See if he's left any surprises for us." Matteo nodded once and melted into the darkness, as silent and intangible as the shadows themselves. He was gone for 3 hours. The others waited, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. When he returned, there was no sound, only a sudden presence beside them, his face a grim mask in the faint starlight. "He has," Matteo said, his voice tight. "About a mile from here. A small homestead. The Millers. He's taken them." A collective wave of cold dread washed over the squad. The Millers were a simple familiar man, a woman, and their 2 young children who had always been friendly to the Thorn Ranch. They were innocents. "He's left the guard of 4 men, Matteo continued, his voice low and angry. "But it's not a prison. It's bait. He's left a trail leading right to them, a trail a blind man could follow. He knows we're close. He's trying to draw us out, to split our force before we can attack his main camp. He is testing us, to see if the righteous widow will risk her plan to save a farmer." The dilemma was agonizing. To ignore the Millers and proceed with the attack on the Serpent's Nest would be to condemn an innocent family to death. But to attempt a rescue would mean engaging the enemy before they were ready, alerting Cain's main force, and potentially destroying the element of surprise that was the cornerstone of their plan. Leo's hand tightened on the grip of his revolver. "We have to go. We can't leave them." "It's what he wants," Silas countered, his voice a low growl of frustration. "He's playing with her. With you, Maddie. He's forcing your hand." They all looked to Madeleine. In that moment, she was not a general making a tactical decision. She was a woman staring into the abyss of her own soul. Her entire campaign had been predicated on a cold, ruthless logic. But this was different. This was not about strategy. It was about the very thing they were fighting for. What was the point of avenging one good man if they allowed another to die in his place? The memory of her father's harsh lessons echoed in her mind. Emotion is a liability. You let your heart rule your head, you die. But the memory of her husband's gentle strength whispered a different truth. Some things are worth dying for. "We do both," Madeleine said, her voice quiet but absolute, cutting through their debate. The decision was made. A new, more dangerous plan was forged in the darkness. They would split their force. "Silas, you and the brothers will proceed to the main canyon," she commanded. "You will stick to the plan. Get into position and wait for my signal. Do not, under any circumstances, attack until you hear my rifle. Even if it is long past dawn, you wait." Silas nodded, his face a mask of grim understanding. He knew she was handing him the harder task, the discipline of waiting while his friends were in peril. Mateo, Leo, you are with me, she continued. We will deal with the Miller homestead. We will be fast, we will be silent, and we will be merciless. We hit them now, before they have a chance to send word to Cain. The price of their vengeance had just become steeper. The odds, already long, had grown impossibly so. But as Madeleine looked at the faces of her men, she saw not fear, but a renewed, hardened resolve. Their cause was no longer just about the past. It was about the present. It was about saving the living, not just avenging the dead. They moved out, to small groups splitting off into the darkness, each on a desperate, near-suicidal mission. Madeleine led her two men on a wide, silent circle towards the captured homestead, their hearts pounding with a terrible, urgent rhythm. The final battle for the soul of the Thorn Valley had begun, not with a grand assault, but with a quiet, desperate fight in the dark for the lives of a single, innocent family. The Miller homestead was a trap, and Madeleine knew it. The 4 outlaws Cain had left behind were not lazy guards. They would be alert, expecting trouble. As she, Leo, and Mateo crept through the sagebrush, the small cabin was a block of menacing darkness against the star-dusted sky. A single lamp burned in the window. 2 on the porch, Mateo whispered, his senses preternaturally sharp. 1 circling the back. 1 inside with the family. No gunfire unless we have no choice, Madeleine commanded. The sound will carry. This has to be silent. They moved like wraiths. Mateo, armed with his hunting knife and a garrote, peeled off to deal with the men circling the rear of the cabin. Madeleine and Leo approached the front, low-crawling the last 50 yards, the dust and the chill of the night air sharp in their nostrils. The 2 men on the porch were talking in low voices, their rifles leaning against the railing. They felt secure. This was the arrogance Madeleine had learned to use as a weapon. She gave Leo the signal. They rose from the darkness as one. Madeleine had her knife, Leo his. Before the 2 sentries could even turn, they were on them. It was brutal, intimate, and silent work. There were 2 soft, wet sounds, 2 grunts of shocked surprise, and 2 bodies slumping to the porch floor. At the same moment, a faint, choked-off cry came from the back of the cabin. Mateo's work was done. 3 down, 1 to go. Madeleine put her eye to the grimy window. She could see Miller and his wife, huddled in a corner with their children, their faces pale with terror. The last outlaw stood in the middle of the room, a rifle held loosely in his hands, his attention focused on the front door. Madeleine looked at Leo and pointed to the window. He nodded in understanding. She moved to the door. She took a deep breath, and then kicked it open with all her force. The outlaw spun around, startled by the sudden violence. In that split second of surprise, Leo shattered the window with the butt of his rifle and fired. The roar of the shot was deafening in the night, a sound that sealed their fate. There was no turning back now. The outlaw was thrown back against the far wall, his chest a ruin. The rescue had taken less than 2 minutes. Madeleine rushed in, ignoring the dead man, her focus entirely on the terrified family. Are you all right? Miller, a stout, brave man, could only nod, his arms wrapped around his family. God bless you, Mrs. Thorne, he stammered. There's no time, Madeleine said, her voice urgent. Take your family and run. Head for the high rocks and don't stop until sunrise. Go now. As the Miller family scrambled out into the night, the vengeance squad knew the gunshot would have been heard at the Serpent's Nest. Cain would know his bait had been taken. He would be expecting an attack. The element of surprise was gone. We go, Madeleine said to Leo and Mateo, her face a hard, determined mask. We go now. We run. They mounted their horses and rode like the wind, not towards the main trail, but towards the sheer eastern cliff face. They had lost time, and they had lost the silence, but they had not lost their resolve. They reached the base of the cliff as the first hints of gray began to soften the eastern sky. The climb was a nightmare, a vertical ascent in the half-light, their rifles slung across their backs, their fingers and boots searching for purchase on the cold and forgiving rock. Madeleine climbed with a ferocity that stunned even Mateo, her movements driven by pure, adrenaline-fueled will. They reached the top just as the sun's first rays struck the highest peaks. The lone sentry on the overwatch was staring down at the canyon entrance, alerted by the distant shot, his attention focused entirely below. He never knew they were there. Mateo dispatched him with a single, silent knife thrust. The canyon lay spread out below them like a map. They could see the camp stirring like a kicked anthill, men running for their weapons, their voices faint shouts on the morning air. They had been seen. Madeleine took her position, resting her Winchester on a rock ledge. This was it, the culmination of everything. She found Silas's position in the rocks below, a flash of movement. They were ready. She took a deep, steadying breath, sighted on a man near the main cabin who seemed to be giving orders, and fired. The crack of her rifle was the signal that unleashed hell. From the rocks at the canyon mouth, Silas, Ben, and Tom opened fire. Their volley was not a panicked spray of bullets, but a disciplined, rolling thunder that tore into the confused outlaws. Silas, with his steady hand, began systematically taking down the men who were trying to organize a defense. From the high ground, Madeleine, Leo, and Mateo added their own devastating fire. They were untouchable, their position unassailable. The outlaws were trapped in a crossfire, a perfectly designed killing box. It was a turkey shoot. Leo. The fire, Madeleine yelled over the din. Leo, his face a mask of ecstatic fury, lit the wicks onto firebombs and hurled them down into the camp. They exploded on the roof of the main cabin and a nearby storehouse, blossoming into plumes of greasy, black smoke and hungry orange flames. Chaos erupted. The remaining outlaws, caught between the rifle fire from above and in front, and the growing inferno within their camp, broke. It was a complete rout. In the heart of the fiery chaos, a single figure emerged from the main cabin. It was Corvus Kane. He was not running. He stood there, a revolver in each hand, his face black with soot, a wild, hateful grin twisting his lips. He ignored the others, his eyes scanning the cliffs, searching for the source of his destruction. His eyes met Madeleine's. Across hundreds of yards of open air, the two commanders, the two architects of this private war, finally faced each other. Kane raised a pistol and fired, the bullet whining harmlessly off the rock far below her. It was a gesture of pure, defiant hatred. Madeleine settled the stock of her Winchester against her shoulder. The world narrowed to the front sight of her rifle and the figure of the man who had destroyed her life. There was no hatred in her heart, no rage, only a vast, cold, and final certainty. She squeezed the trigger. Corvus Kane was thrown backward as if struck by a giant's fist, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dirt of his burning, dying empire. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the crackle of the flames. It was over. The silence that followed the final gunshot in the serpent's nest was more profound than any noise. It was a silence filled with the weight of everything that had happened, every life taken, every choice made. From the high cliff, Madeleine watched as her men, the 5 ranch hands she had forged into a weapon, cautiously advanced into the smoking ruins of Corvus Kane's camp. The battle was won. The war was over. They returned to the Thorn Valley 2 days later, not as a triumphant army, but as a solemn procession. They were 5 riders now, not 6, leading a horse with an empty saddle. They were not the same men who had left. They were older, harder, their eyes holding the haunted knowledge of the things they had seen and done. The valley itself seemed to sense the change. The air was still, the birds quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They buried Tom, the quieter of the 2 brothers, on a gentle, wildflower-strewn hill next to Jacob Thorne. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by the 5 survivors, each man a silent monument to their shared loss. Tom's death was the final, brutal invoice for their victory, a price that would never be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the story of the raid spread through the territory like a wildfire, becoming an instant, indelible legend. They were called the Thorn Riders, the ghosts of the valley, Jacob's Fist. They were hailed as heroes who had done what the law could not, cleansing the land of a vicious plague. But for the survivors, the reality was far more complex. The legend was a story told by others, the reality was a burden they carried alone. They were not heroes, they were survivors, men who had waded through blood to find their way back home, only to find that home was not quite the same, because they were not the same. They tried, for a time, to return to the life they had known. They mended the fences, branded the new calves, and rode the long patrols. But the easy rhythm of ranch life felt foreign now. Their hands, so accustomed to the cold steel of a revolver, felt clumsy with a branding iron. Their eyes, trained to scan for threats in every shadow, could not unsee the ghosts of the men they had killed. The truth became undeniable at a final meeting around the corral fire, on the very spot where they had sworn their oath. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows, just as it had that first night, but the faces it illuminated were different, harder, etched with the scars of their journey. "It's not enough," Liu said, his voice low and raspy. The hot-headed boy was gone, replaced by a man with a cold fire in his eyes. "We cut the head off one snake, but this land is full of them. What about the next Corvus Cain? What about the next family, like the Millers, who have no one to stand for them?" He looked at Madeleine, his gaze intense. "You taught us to be a weapon, Maddie. You can't just put a weapon like us back in the sheath and expect it to be a hammer again." Madeleine looked at the faces of her men, Silas's weary wisdom, Mateo's quiet intensity, Ben's steadfast loyalty, Leo's burning purpose. She saw the truth in his words. She had not just trained them, she had transformed them. And in doing so, she had transformed herself. She could no longer be content tending a garden while wolves roamed the land. The cold, clear purpose that had saved her from her grief now demanded more. Her decision was not a choice, it was an acceptance of who they had all become. They did not drift away. They did not stay and try to be something they no longer were. 1 week later, the 5 of them rode out of the Thorn Valley, not as a defeated group, but as a unit with a new and spoken mission. They left the ranch in the capable hands of a new foreman Silas had recommended, a good man with a family, ensuring that Jacob's dream of a peaceful, thriving home would continue. Madeleine Thorne and her vengeance squad simply vanished. They shed their names, their pasts, and became a rumor, a whisper on the wind. But their work continued. They became the legend the Outlaws had imagined them to be, a force of relentless, phantom justice. When a greedy land baron tried to force settlers out of a fertile valley, his hired guns would be found one morning, disarmed, bound, and left with a single stark T carved into the door of their bunkhouse. When a band of raiders began to terrorize a stagecoach line, their remote camps would be hid in the dead of night, their supplies burned, their horses scattered, their will to fight broken by a ghost army that struck and melted back into the darkness. They became the consequence. The justice that existed where the law did not. No one ever saw their faces. No one knew where they came from or where they went. They left no witnesses, only stories, and a single, chilling calling card. And so a new warning was born, a piece of frontier wisdom passed down in hushed tones from one generation of outlaw to the next. Pray you never draw the attention of the widow and her riders. For if you do, you'll find there is no road that leads back home.